For 11 centuries, Constantinople had been the unconquerable city. Emperors and caliphs, Persians and Arabs, Avars and Bulgars, Russians and Crusaders, all had broken themselves against its walls. The triple fortifications that Emperor Theodosius had built 1,000 years before still stood, guarding the last fragment of the Roman Empire, defying every army that had ever approached. The city that Constantine the Great had founded as the new Rome had outlived the old one by a millennium, surviving sieges that would have erased any other place from the map. In the spring of 1432, in the Ottoman capital of Edirne, a boy was born who would finally bring those walls down. Mehmed came into the world on March 30th, 1432, the son of Sultan Murad II and Huma Hatun, a slave concubine in the imperial harem. He was not the eldest son. That position belonged to his half-brother Alaeddin, and his mother's status placed him lower in the hierarchy of succession than princes born to nobler women. Nothing about his birth suggested that he would become one of history's most consequential rulers. He was simply another Ottoman prince, one of several potential heirs in a dynasty where succession was never certain, and brothers often became rivals unto death. The court at Edirne was a hothouse of ambition, intrigue, and learning. The Ottomans had risen from a minor Anatolian principality to a power that straddled 2 continents, and their capital reflected that transformation. Scholars debated theology in the madrasas. Generals planned campaigns against the Christian kingdoms of the Balkans. Merchants brought goods from Venice and Genoa, from Persia and Egypt. The young Mehmed grew up surrounded by men who had conquered provinces and men who had mastered ancient texts, and he absorbed lessons from both. His education was extraordinary, even by the standards of Ottoman princes. Murad II understood that rulers needed more than martial training. They needed to understand law, religion, history, and the cultures of the peoples they would govern. He assigned Mehmed tutors who were among the finest minds in the Islamic world. Mollah Ghorani taught him jurisprudence and Quranic interpretation. Akhshemseddin, a Sufi sheikh of profound influence, shaped his spiritual development and filled his mind with prophecies about the destiny that awaited great conquerors. Mehmed proved a voracious student. He mastered Arabic and Persian, the languages of scholarship and poetry, alongside his native Turkish. He learned Greek to read the classical texts in their original form, and later added Latin, Serbian, and perhaps Hebrew to his repertoire. He studied mathematics and astronomy, geography and military science, philosophy, and the histories of empires that had risen and fallen across the centuries. His intellect was restless, omnivorous, never satisfied with mastery of one field when others remained unexplored. 2 obsessions emerged early and never released their grip. The first was Alexander the Great, the Macedonian conqueror who had built an empire from Greece to India, before dying at 32, became Mehmed's model and measure. He read every account of Alexander's campaigns he could find, studied his tactics, imagined himself following in those legendary footsteps. To surpass Alexander, to build something even greater, even more lasting, became the ambition against which Mehmed measured all his other desires. The second obsession was Constantinople. The city haunted him. He collected maps of its defenses, interrogated travelers who had seen its walls, studied the accounts of every siege it had survived. The Prophet Muhammad himself, according to a hadith that Mehmed's tutors made certain he knew, had promised special honor to the army that would finally conquer the city. Verily, you shall conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful leader will he be, and what a wonderful army will that army be. The prophecy merged with Mehmed's ambition until conquering Constantinople became not just a strategic goal, but a destiny, a divine appointment that he alone could fulfill. He was 12 years old when that destiny seemed suddenly within reach. In 1444, Murad II made a decision that stunned the court. He abdicated. The Sultan was exhausted. Years of warfare against the Hungarians, the Venetians, and various Balkan powers had worn him down, and the recent death of his eldest son, Aladdin, had broken something in his spirit. He withdrew to Manisa in Anatolia, seeking peace in contemplation and prayer, and placed the empire in the hands of his 12-year-old son. Mehmed II became Sultan. The boy who had dreamed of surpassing Alexander now held real power, and discovered immediately how constrained that power could be. The court factions that had deferred to his father saw in Mehmed an opportunity to advance their own interests. Chandalı Halil Pasha, the Grand Vizier, led a faction of cautious advisors who favored peace with the Christians and viewed the young Sultan as someone to be managed rather than obeyed. They smiled, they bowed, they offered counsel that was really command, and Mehmed learned what it meant to wear a crown without wielding authority. Then the Christians attacked. The Hungarian regent, John Hunyadi, seeing an opportunity in the succession, launched a crusade into Ottoman territory, despite a treaty that should have guaranteed peace. The young Sultan's forces proved unable to halt the advance, and panic spread through Edirne. The faction around Halil Pasha sent desperate messages to Murad, begging him to return and save the empire from the child who was failing to defend it. Murad came back. He resumed command, met the Crusaders at Varna in November 1444, and destroyed them so thoroughly that Hungarian power never fully recovered. The cardinal who had led the crusade died on the battlefield. The threat to Ottoman survival evaporated in a single afternoon of slaughter. But for Mehmed, the aftermath was bitter. His father remained on the throne, relegating him once again to the status of heir rather than ruler. The boy who had briefly tasted supreme power was sent to Manisa as a provincial governor, told to study, to prepare, to wait. The courtiers who had undermined him remained in their positions, Halil Pasha chief among them. Mehmed's first reign had lasted barely 2 years, and it had ended in humiliation. He did not forget. He was not the kind of boy who forgot anything. The faces of those who had doubted him, the names of those who had worked against him, the lessons of what happened when a ruler lacked the strength to impose his will. All of it went into the memory that would guide him when his time came again. And he knew his time would come. He was 14 years old, exiled to a provincial court, surrounded by tutors and minders, rather than generals and ministers. But Constantinople still stood on its peninsula, still unconquered, still waiting. And Mehmed still intended to be the one who finally brought it down. He returned to his studies with a focus that his tutors found almost frightening. He was no longer merely learning, he was preparing. The years at Manisa transformed him. The provincial capital was far from the intrigues of Edirne, far from the courtiers who had humiliated him, far from the father who had reclaimed the throne. Here, Mehmed could study without interruption, plan without scrutiny, and cultivate relationships with men who shared his ambitions rather than those who sought to contain them. Chief among his new allies was Zaganos Pasha, a military commander of Christian convert origins, who recognized in the young prince something the cautious faction at court refused to see: a will to conquest that would not be denied. Zaganos encouraged Mehmed's aggressive instincts, discussed strategy and siegecraft with him, and helped him build a circle of advisors who would support bold action when the time came. These men became Mehmed's true court, loyal to him personally, committed to his vision, ready to act when he finally held power without constraints. The contrast with his father's court could not have been sharper. Chandler Halil Pasha still dominated the councils in Edirne, still counseled caution and accommodation with the Christian powers, still represented everything Mehmed had learned to despise. The Grand Vizier had helped push him aside once. Mehmed did not intend to allow it again. His personality hardened during these years into something his contemporaries found difficult to read. He spoke little, revealing his thoughts to almost no one. He smiled rarely and laughed less. He observed everything, remembered everything, and betrayed nothing of what he was thinking until the moment he chose to act. Those who met him noted his intensity, the dark eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, the sense of coiled energy waiting to be released. He was becoming the man who would terrify diplomats and generals alike, utterly self-contained, utterly focused, utterly ruthless. He continued his education with systematic precision. Geography received particular attention. He studied maps obsessively, memorizing terrain, calculating distances, imagining campaigns across landscapes he had never seen. Siegecraft fascinated him. He learned the mathematics of artillery, the engineering of walls and how to break them, the logistics of supplying armies far from home. History remained his constant companion, but now he read it as a strategist rather than a scholar, extracting lessons about how empires were built and how they fell. Constantinople never left his thoughts. He collected every scrap of information about the city, the thickness of its walls, the depth of its harbors, the strength of its garrison, the politics of its dying court. He knew that the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to almost nothing, that the emperor ruled little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories, that the ancient power survived on borrowed time and Venetian charity. He knew the city could fall. He intended to be the one who made it fall. Meanwhile, his father continued to fight. Murad II could not escape the wars that had driven him to abdicate in the first place. In 1448, John Hunyadi, the same Hungarian commander who had launched the Crusade of Varna, invaded Ottoman territory again, seeking revenge for his earlier defeat. Murad met him at Kosovo, on the same field where the Ottomans had broken Serbian power 60 years before, and destroyed his army in a 3-day battle that ended Hungarian ambitions in the Balkans for a generation. Mehmed did not participate in the battle. He remained at Manisa, studying, waiting, watching reports arrive from the front. His father's victories were impressive, but they were his father's victories. Mehmed wanted his own. The relationship between father and son remained distant. Murad seems to have recognized his son's abilities, but also his dangerous intensity. The Sultan kept Mehmed far from court, far from real power, perhaps hoping that time would temper the young man's ambitions into something more manageable. If so, he miscalculated badly. Every year of exile only sharpened Mehmed's determination, only deepened his conviction that he was destined for greatness, that his father's caution was delaying. By 1451, Murad II was exhausted. The endless campaigns had worn down even his considerable stamina, and he had begun withdrawing again from active governance, leaving more and more to his ministers while he sought the peace that had eluded him throughout his reign. He was only 47 years old, but he had been fighting for 3 decades, and his body was failing. On February 3rd, 1451, Murad II died at Edirne. The messenger who brought the news to Manisa found Mehmed ready. The young prince had been waiting for this moment for 7 years, planning for it, preparing every detail of what he would do when it finally arrived. He mounted immediately and rode for Edirne, with a speed that left his escort struggling to keep pace. There would be no period of mourning, no gradual assumption of power, no opportunity for the factions at court to organize against him. He was 19 years old, and this time he would not be pushed aside. His first act as Sultan announced the kind of ruler he intended to be. Murad had left behind an infant son, a potential rival whose mere existence could become a rallying point for anyone who opposed Mehmed's policies. Previous sultans had faced civil wars sparked by exactly such situations. Brothers fighting brothers, the empire torn apart by succession disputes that dragged on for years. Mehmed solved the problem with brutal efficiency. He ordered the infant drowned in his bath. The execution shocked even those accustomed to Ottoman succession practices. The child had posed no immediate threat. He was a baby, years away from being able to challenge anyone. But Mehmed was eliminating possibilities, closing doors that might one day open onto chaos. He would permit no rivals, no alternative candidates, no one around whom opposition could coalesce. The empire would have one master, and everyone would know from the first day exactly how far that master was willing to go. Chandler Halil Pasha remained Grand Vizier for now. Mehmed was not yet strong enough to purge the old faction entirely, and Halil's administrative experience was genuinely valuable. But the Grand Vizier understood that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The boy he had once managed was now a man who had murdered an infant brother without hesitation. The cautious policies Halil had championed would not survive the new reign. Mehmed summoned his council and made his intentions clear. He would not be a sultan who maintained the status quo, who fought defensive wars and signed treaties that preserved a balance between Ottoman power and Christian survival. He would be a conqueror. He would complete what his ancestors had begun. He would take Constantinople. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what he was proposing: an assault on the most heavily fortified city in the world, a campaign that had defeated every army that had attempted it for 1,000 years. The cautious advisors thought him mad. The bold ones thought him magnificent. Mehmed ignored them all. He had been planning this for 7 years. Now he would make it real. The preparations began immediately, and they revealed a mind that thought in systems rather than gestures. Mehmed understood that Constantinople had survived for 11 centuries, not merely because of its walls, but because of its position. The city sat on a peninsula, protected by water on 3 sides, and by the massive Theodosian walls on the 4th. The Golden Horn, a natural harbour north of the city, was guarded by a chain that could be raised to block enemy ships. The Bosphorus Strait connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, and whoever controlled that strait controlled the trade routes that made empires rich. Previous attackers had thrown armies against the walls and failed. Mehmed intended to strangle the city before he stormed it. In the spring of 1452, he began constructing a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from an older Ottoman fortification on the Asian side. The location was carefully chosen, at the strait's narrowest point, where cannons mounted on both shores could destroy any ship attempting to pass without permission. The message to Constantinople was unmistakable. The Ottomans now controlled the city's lifeline to the Black Sea, its access to grain from the northern colonies that kept its population fed. The fortress rose with astonishing speed. Mehmed drove his workers relentlessly, and Rumeli Hisara, the fortress of Europe, was completed in just 4 months. A feat of engineering an organization that announced Ottoman capabilities to anyone paying attention. The Byzantines called it by another name, Boaz Kezan, the throat cutter. They understood what it meant. Constantine XI, Palaiologos, the Byzantine emperor, watched these preparations with the desperation of a man who saw death approaching and could do nothing to stop it. He was a capable ruler, brave, intelligent, devoted to his people. But he commanded a city of perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, a treasury that was empty, and an army that numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands. He sent ambassadors to Mehmed protesting the fortress construction, reminding the Sultan of treaties that supposedly guaranteed Byzantine territory. Mehmed received them politely, made no concessions, and continued building. Constantine appealed to the West. For centuries, Byzantine emperors had sought help from Catholic Europe against Muslim enemies, and for centuries, that help had come with conditions, usually the submission of the Orthodox Church to papal authority, that Constantinople found almost as threatening as conquest. Now, with extinction looming, Constantine accepted the union of the churches that his predecessors had resisted. It made no difference. The Western powers sent prayers, expressions of concern, and almost no soldiers. Venice and Genoa, the maritime republics with the most at stake, were too busy competing with each other to mount a serious defense of a city they had helped weaken through decades of commercial exploitation. Mehmed ensured they stayed divided. His diplomacy was as methodical as his military preparations. He signed treaties with Venice that promised protection for their trading posts, treaties he had no intention of honoring any longer than necessary, but which kept Venetian fleets at home during the critical months. He neutralized Hungary with similar agreements. He isolated Constantinople as systematically as he fortified the Bosphorus, cutting away potential allies one by one until the city stood alone. Meanwhile, he was building a weapon that would render the Great Walls obsolete. A Hungarian engineer named Urban had offered his services to Constantine XI, promising to cast cannons that could defend the city against any attack. Constantine could not afford his price. Urban then travelled to Edirne and made the same offer to Mehmed, who could afford anything. The Sultan commissioned Urban to build the largest bombard the world had ever seen, a monster that could fire stone balls weighing over 1/2 ton, capable of demolishing walls that had stood for 1,000 years. The cannon took months to cast and required a crew of hundreds to operate. Moving it from Edirne to Constantinople demanded teams of 60 oxen and took weeks of careful transport over roads specially prepared for its passage. It could fire only 7 times a day, and its barrel cracked after weeks of use. None of that mattered. What mattered was that no fortification in the world could withstand its impact. The Theodosian walls, which had never been breached by any army, would fall to technology that had not existed when they were built. Mehmed assembled the largest army the Ottomans had ever gathered. Estimates range from 80,000 to over 100,000 men, though exact numbers are impossible to verify. Infantry, cavalry, engineers, sappers, siege specialists, and the elite Janissary Corps all converged on the staging grounds west of Constantinople. A fleet of over 100 ships prepared to blockade the city from the sea. The logistics of feeding and supplying such a force would have overwhelmed most medieval governments. Mehmed's administration handled it with the efficiency of a machine built for this single purpose. He also prepared psychologically. Mehmed understood that Constantinople's fall would be more than a military event. It would be a symbolic rupture with everything the Christian world believed about the natural order. For 1,000 years, The city had represented the continuity of Rome, the survival of Christian civilization against Islamic expansion. Its fall would announce that history had turned, that the future belonged to the Ottomans. He intended the siege to be not just effective, but spectacular, a demonstration of power that would echo across continents. By early 1453, everything was ready. The fortress controlled the Bosphorus. The cannon was complete. The army was assembled. The diplomacy had isolated the target. Mehmed had spent nearly 2 years preparing for a campaign that would last less than 2 months, building overwhelming force and positioning it perfectly before committing to battle. On April 2nd, 1453, the Ottoman army appeared before the walls of Constantinople. Mehmed pitched his tent within sight of the Golden Gate, the ceremonial entrance through which Roman emperors had once returned in triumph. The message was deliberate. He intended to enter through that gate himself, not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror. Inside the city, Constantine XI commanded perhaps 7,000 defenders, a mix of Byzantine soldiers, Venetian and Genoese volunteers, and armed civilians. Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese nobleman experienced in siege warfare, had arrived with 700 professional soldiers and taken command of the wall defences. They would face odds of more than 10 to 1, defending walls that stretched for miles with a force that could barely cover the most vulnerable sections. The greatest siege in medieval history was about to begin, and Mehmed, 21 years old, had positioned himself to become either the greatest conqueror in Ottoman history or a cautionary tale about ambition exceeding ability. He had no intention of becoming a cautionary tale. The bombardment began on April 6th, and the world had never heard anything like it. Urban's great cannon roared across the plain, hurling half-ton stones into walls that had stood since the reign of Theodosius II. The impact could be heard for miles, a deep, shattering boom that announced the death of an age. Smaller cannons joined the barrage, dozens of them pounding the fortifications day after day, shaking loose stones that had been set 1,000 years before. The defenders worked frantically each night to repair the damage, piling rubble and timber into the breaches, but each morning brought fresh destruction. Inside the city, the population prayed. Churches overflowed with the faithful seeking divine intervention, their liturgies a constant murmur beneath the thunder of Ottoman guns. Icons were paraded along the walls. Priests promised that God would not abandon his city, that the Virgin Mary herself would descend to drive away the infidels as she had in sieges past. The defenders clung to faith because faith was nearly all they had. Constantine XI was everywhere, inspecting defences, encouraging soldiers, coordinating the impossible task of holding miles of walls with a handful of men. Giovanni Giustiniani commanded the most critical sector, the Mesotachion, where the walls were weakest and where Mehmed had concentrated his heaviest fire. The Genoese captain proved his worth daily, organizing counterattacks against Ottoman probes, maintaining discipline among men who knew they were probably going to die. The siege settled into a brutal rhythm. Ottoman assaults came at intervals, testing different sections of the walls, probing for weakness, exhausting defenders who could never rest because they never knew where the next attack would fall. Mehmed rotated his troops, keeping fresh units at the front while the Byzantines grew ever more depleted. Time favored the attackers. Every day that passed wore down the defenders a little more, thinned their ranks, frayed their hope. But the walls held. Damaged, patched, crumbling in places, they still stood, and every assault Mehmed launched was driven back with losses that his commanders found disturbing. The Janissaries, the elite infantry who had never failed to take a fortification, recoiled from the breaches where Giustiniani's men met them with desperate ferocity. 2 weeks into the siege, then 3, then 4, and Constantinople still had not fallen. Mehmed needed a new approach. He found one. The Golden Horn, the inlet that protected Constantinople's northern flank, was blocked by the great chain that stretched from the city to the Genoese colony of Galata across the water. Ottoman ships could not enter, which meant the defenders needed only minimal forces on those walls. Mehmed decided to put ships in the Golden Horn anyway, not by breaking the chain, but by going around it. On the night of April 22nd, Ottoman crews began dragging ships overland. They had constructed a roadway of greased logs running from the Bosphorus up a hill and down into the Golden Horn behind the chain. 70 ships, some accounts say more, were hauled out of the water, placed on wooden cradles, and dragged by teams of men and oxen over the ridge and back into the sea. By morning, an Ottoman fleet floated in waters that should have been inaccessible, threatening walls that were barely defended, stretching Byzantine resources past the breaking point. The psychological impact was devastating. If the Ottomans could move ships over mountains, what could they not do? The defenders, who had held grimly to hope, began to understand that they faced not just superior numbers, but superior will. An enemy who would find a way through every obstacle, over every barrier, around every defense. The siege entered its final phase. Mehmed offered Constantine terms: surrender the city, and the emperor could retire safely to the Morea with his household, refuse. And when the walls fell, as they would fall, the traditional 3 days of plunder would commence, with all the horrors that implied. Constantine refused. He would die defending his city. He had made his choice. On the night of May 28th, Mehmed gathered his commanders and announced that the final assault would come at dawn. He had done everything possible. The bombardment had created multiple breaches. His troops were rested and eager. The defenders were exhausted beyond measure. Tomorrow, Constantinople would fall, or his army would break trying to take it. There would be no middle ground. Across the walls, the Byzantines held a final service in the Hagia Sophia. Orthodox and Catholic, Greek and Italian, soldier and civilian. They put aside the theological disputes that had divided them and prayed together in the great church that had been the heart of Eastern Christianity for 9 centuries. They knew what dawn would bring. Many confessed their sins, took communion, and said goodbye to families they would likely never see again. The assault began in the early hours of May 29th. Mehmed sent his irregulars first, expendable troops whose purpose was to exhaust the defenders before the real attack commenced. They died in the breaches, pushed back by Giustiniani's men, but they accomplished their purpose. The Byzantines expended strength they could not replace. Then came the Anatolian regulars, better trained, better equipped, throwing themselves at the walls in waves that seemed endless. Still, the defenders held. Giustiniani stood in the thickest fighting, rallying his men, repelling assault after assault. Then a bullet or a crossbow bolt, accounts differ, struck Giustiniani in the chest, piercing his armor. The wound was not immediately fatal, but the Genoese captain, perhaps in shock, demanded to be carried from the walls to receive treatment. His men, seeing their commander retreat, began to waver. Constantine begged him to stay. The emperor understood what everyone on those walls understood. If Giustiniani left, the defense would collapse. But the wounded captain would not or could not continue. He was carried through the city to a Genoese ship in the harbour, where he died shortly after. His men retreated with him, leaving a gap in the defence at the worst possible moment. At nearly the same time, a small group of Ottomans discovered that a gate, the Kirka Porta, A sally port that had been left open after a sortie had not been secured. They poured through, raising their banners on the walls, creating the appearance of a breakthrough. Panic spread among defenders who saw Ottoman flags flying above them. The Janissaries charged. Mehmed's elite infantry stormed the breaches with a fury they had been holding in reserve. The defense, already cracking from Giustiniani's departure and the chaos at the Kirkaporta, shattered. Ottoman soldiers flooded into the city, and what had been a siege became a massacre. Constantine XI Palaiologos died in the chaos. The last Roman emperor, for that is what he was, however diminished his realm, reportedly tore off his imperial regalia so he would not be recognized, and charged into the Ottoman advance with sword drawn. His body was never definitively identified. Some accounts claim his head was presented to Mehmed. Others say he was buried where he fell, unknown among the common dead. The mystery suited the magnitude of the moment. Empires do not die with paperwork and signatures. They die like Constantine died, fighting, falling, vanishing into the dust of their own destruction. Mehmed entered Constantinople in the afternoon. He rode to the Hagia Sophia, the great church that had been the architectural wonder of the Christian world since Justinian built it 9 centuries before. His soldiers were already inside, beginning to strip the treasures accumulated across 1,000 years. Mehmed stopped them. He dismounted, knelt, and sprinkled earth upon his turban in a gesture of humility before God. Then he entered the church and performed the first Muslim prayers ever heard within its walls. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque, not destroyed, not desecrated in the way Christians had feared, but converted, its mosaics covered but not obliterated, its structure preserved while its purpose was transformed. Mehmed could have reduced it to rubble as a statement of triumph. Instead, he chose to keep it standing as a statement of succession. He was not destroying Rome. He was inheriting it. The traditional 3 days of plunder had been promised to the army, and Mehmed honored the promise, partially. The sack was terrible, as all medieval sacks were terrible. Killing, looting, enslaving. The horrors that victorious armies inflicted on conquered cities as a matter of course. But Mehmed cut the plunder short, asserting control before the destruction became total. He needed Constantinople intact. He needed its population alive. He needed the city to function as a capital, not moulder as a ruin. By nightfall on May 29th, 1453, the city that had been Constantinople for 11 centuries had a new name. The Ottomans called it Istanbul, probably derived from a Greek phrase meaning to the city, though the old name would persist in European usage for centuries to come. And Mehmed had a new title. He was no longer merely Sultan. He was Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome. The empire that had begun with Augustus, that had converted to Christianity under Constantine, that had survived in the East while the West fell to barbarians. That empire had not ended. It had been conquered, absorbed, transformed. The 21-year-old Sultan now claimed its legacy as his own. The prophecy was fulfilled. The walls were broken. The unconquerable city had been conquered. Mehmed's reign had truly begun. The conqueror faced a problem. He had won a corpse. Constantinople, in the aftermath of the siege, was a ghost of itself. The population had been slaughtered, enslaved, or scattered. Entire districts lay empty, their houses abandoned, their markets silent. The great city that had once held 500,000 people now contained perhaps 50,000, and many of those were Ottoman soldiers rather than permanent residents. Mehmed had conquered the most famous city in the world, but he had conquered a ruin. He set about rebuilding it with the same systematic intensity he had brought to its destruction. The first priority was people. Mehmed issued orders across his empire, requiring populations to relocate to Istanbul, Muslims from Anatolia, Christians from the Balkans, Jews from wherever they could be found. The transfers were sometimes voluntary, sometimes forced, but the intent was clear. Istanbul would not be a museum of Ottoman triumph, but a living capital, diverse and dynamic, filled with the merchants and craftsmen and scholars who made cities function. Within a decade, the population had tripled. Within a generation, Istanbul would become the largest city in Europe. His treatment of the Christians surprised those who had expected persecution. The Greek Orthodox Church had been Constantinople's spiritual heart, and Mehmed understood that destroying it would generate endless resistance from his millions of Christian subjects. Instead, he chose to control it, and through it, to control them. He personally selected Gennadius Scholarius, a monk who had opposed the union with Rome, as the new patriarch of Constantinople. The ceremony echoed Byzantine tradition. Mehmed presented Gennadius with the staff of office, just as the emperors had done for centuries. The message was unmistakable. The Sultan had replaced the emperor as the protector of Orthodox Christianity, and the church would now function under Ottoman authority rather than opposing it. Gennadius became responsible for his community's behavior. In exchange, that community received guarantees of worship, property, and legal autonomy that would persist for centuries. Jews received similar treatment. Mehmed actively encouraged Jewish settlement in Istanbul, recognizing their value as merchants, physicians, and craftsmen. When Spain expelled its Jewish population in 1492, Ottoman domains would become the primary refuge, a policy that began with Mehmed's deliberate cultivation of religious diversity as a tool of governance. He did not do this from tolerance in any modern sense. Mehmed was a pragmatist who understood that empires built on persecution consumed themselves in endless rebellions. The millet system he formalized, communities organized by religion, each governing its own internal affairs under the Sultan's ultimate authority, created stability through separation. Christians and Jews remained subjects, not equals, but they were subjects with defined rights, rather than victims awaiting destruction. The city itself rose from the ashes. Mehmed launched construction projects that transformed Istanbul's skyline and announced Ottoman permanence. The Fatih Mosque, the Conqueror's Mosque, rose on the site of the ruined Church of the Holy Apostles. Its vast complex, including schools, hospitals, kitchens for the poor, and accommodation for travelers. It was not merely a place of worship, but a statement of imperial ambition, demonstrating that the Ottomans could build as magnificently as they could conquer. Topkapi Palace began taking shape on the peninsula's tip, where the waters of the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus met. The complex would grow over decades into a labyrinth of courtyards, gardens, treasuries, and audience halls, the administrative heart of an empire that would eventually stretch from Hungary to Yemen. Mehmed designed it as a machine for ruling, each space calibrated for specific functions, privacy increasing as one moved deeper into the complex, the Sultan himself at the center, accessible only to those he chose to admit. But Mehmed was not content merely to rule. He intended to transform the nature of Ottoman governance itself. The Kanunname, Mehmed's law code, systematized Ottoman administration in ways that would endure for centuries. It defined the relationships between the Sultan and his officials, established procedures for taxation and justice, and created a framework that allowed the empire to function regardless of individual personalities. Previous sultans had ruled through personal authority and tribal loyalty. Mehmed created institutions that could outlast any individual, including himself. He centralized power with ruthless efficiency. The old Turkish nobility who had helped build the empire found themselves displaced by a new elite, slaves of the Sultan, many of them Christian converts, who owed everything to imperial favor and could be discarded the moment they ceased to be useful. The Janissaries, the elite infantry who had stormed Constantinople's walls, became the model. Absolutely loyal, because absolutely dependent professional soldiers without families or property to divide their allegiance. Chandalar Halil Pasha discovered what this new order meant for those who had opposed Mehmed's will. The Grand Vizier, who had counselled caution, who had tried to manage the young Sultan during his first reign, who had survived the conquest by making himself useful. Halil was arrested shortly after the fall of Constantinople, accused of treasonous communication with the Byzantines, and executed. His property was confiscated. His family was destroyed. The man who had represented the old way of doing things became a lesson in the consequences of standing against the new. Scholars gathered at Mehmed's court from across the Islamic world and beyond. He patronized philosophers, astronomers, historians, and poets with a generosity that reflected genuine intellectual curiosity rather than mere display. He read Greek, discussed Aristotle and Plato with learned men, collected manuscripts that had survived the siege, and commissioned translations that preserved classical knowledge for future generations. The same mind that had calculated artillery trajectories and troop deployments could engage with abstract philosophy and appreciate artistic beauty. He commissioned a portrait from Gentile Bellini, a Venetian painter whose presence at the Ottoman court scandalized some of Mehmed's more conservative subjects. The portrait that survives shows a face of striking intensity. Hooded eyes, prominent nose, thin lips pressed together. The expression of a man who revealed nothing he did not choose to reveal. It was the first realistic portrait of an Ottoman sultan, a gesture toward European artistic traditions that complemented Mehmed's claim to Roman imperial succession. By 1463, he had transformed a conquered ruin into a thriving imperial capital and established administrative systems that would govern millions for centuries. But he was not finished conquering. The Byzantine successor states still survived on the empire's fringes, and as long as they survived, his victory remained incomplete. Serbia fell in 1459. Its fortresses reduced one by one until the medieval kingdom ceased to exist as an independent state. The Morea, the Byzantine province in southern Greece, was absorbed in 1460. Its Palaiologos rulers killed or scattered. Athens, the city that had given birth to Western civilization, passed under Ottoman control with barely a murmur of resistance. Trebizond was the last. This tiny empire on the Black Sea coast, ruled by a branch of the Byzantine imperial family, had survived by isolation and diplomacy for over 200 years, after Constantinople fell to the Crusaders in 1204. In 1461, Mehmed arrived with an army that made resistance pointless. The Emperor David surrendered, was taken to Istanbul with his family, and 2 years later was executed along with his sons when Mehmed decided their continued existence posed a threat. With Trebizond's fall, the last remnant of the Byzantine world was extinguished. The Roman Empire that had begun with Augustus, that had endured, transformed, diminished, but never entirely died, was finally, irrevocably over. And the man who had ended it was still only 30 years old. He had conquered Constantinople, rebuilt it as his capital, systematized an empire, and eliminated every successor state that might have claimed Roman legitimacy. Most conquerors would have been satisfied. Mehmed looked toward new horizons. The conquest of Constantinople had been a beginning, not a culmination. Mehmed understood that the Ottoman Empire remained vulnerable as long as hostile powers surrounded it. Venice controlled the Aegean islands and key coastal fortresses. Hungary threatened from the north. Persia loomed in the east. Smaller enemies, Albanian rebels, Wallachian princes, the remnants of crusading ambition nibbled at the edges. The empire he had inherited and expanded was still a work in progress, its borders contested, its supremacy unconfirmed. He would spend the next 2 decades confirming it. Bosnia fell in 1463, its king executed, its nobles scattered, its territory absorbed into the Ottoman system. The campaign was swift, efficient, and brutal, a demonstration that resistance to Ottoman expansion was not merely futile, but fatal. The Bosnian Church, a heretical sect that had survived centuries of persecution by both Rome and Constantinople, found unexpected tolerance under Ottoman rule. Many Bosnians converted to Islam, becoming some of the empire's most loyal subjects. Mehmed was building a realm where religious diversity served imperial unity. Wallachia proved more troublesome. The principality between the Danube and the Carpathians had been an Ottoman vassal, but its prince, Vlad III, known to history as the Impaler, had different ideas. In 1462, Vlad launched a campaign of terror against Ottoman forces and Muslim communities, impaling prisoners by the thousands, conducting night raids that killed Ottoman soldiers in their camps, and sending defiant messages to Mehmed that made clear he would not submit. Mehmed invaded personally. What he found when he approached Vlad's capital became legend. A forest of stakes stretching for miles, bearing the rotting corpses of 20,000 Ottoman prisoners. Even the Sultan, who had built his own towers of skulls, was reportedly shaken by the display. Vlad escaped into Hungary. His brother Radu, who had been raised at the Ottoman court, was installed as a compliant prince, and Wallachia returned to vassalage. But Vlad's resistance entered folklore, eventually transforming into the vampire legends that still bear his name. The real war was with Venice. The Maritime Republic had watched Constantinople's fall with horror, understanding that Ottoman control of the straits threatened the trade routes that made Venice rich. For a decade, an uneasy peace held. Neither side quite ready for the confrontation both knew was coming. In 1463, the peace shattered, and the Ottoman-Venetian War began, a conflict that would last 16 years and reshape the Eastern Mediterranean. It was not a war of dramatic battles, but of grinding attrition. Ottoman armies besieged Venetian fortresses one by one, reducing strongholds that had guarded the sea lanes for centuries. Venice's naval superiority meant nothing against walls defended from the land side. Argos fell, then the fortress of Negroponte, the great Venetian base on the island of Euboea. In 1470, its garrison massacred after a siege that demonstrated Ottoman willingness to pay any price for victory. Albania resisted longest. Skanderbeg, George Castriotti, an Albanian nobleman who had been raised as a hostage at the Ottoman court before escaping to lead his people's rebellion, had defied Ottoman armies for 2 decades. His guerrilla tactics in the Albanian mountains frustrated every campaign sent against him, and his legend grew with each failed invasion. Mehmed reportedly considered him the only commander he could not defeat through conventional means. Skanderbeg died in 1468. An Albanian resistance crumbled within a decade. The fortresses that had held out under his leadership fell one by one, and Albania was absorbed into the empire. But the years of fighting had demonstrated the limits of Ottoman power against determined resistance in difficult terrain, a lesson that future enemies would study carefully. To the east, a different threat emerged. Uzun Hasan, ruler of the Akayunlu Confederation that controlled Persia, and much of Anatolia's eastern reaches, had built an alliance with Venice and other Ottoman enemies. He represented the nightmare scenario, a coordinated attack on two fronts that could overwhelm even Ottoman resources. European powers sent him weapons, advisors, and promises of support, hoping that together they could check the Sultan who had conquered Constantinople. Mehmed moved first. In 1473, he marched east with an army that included the artillery that had become the Ottoman signature. At the Battle of Bashkent, Ottoman guns shattered Akayunlu cavalry charges that might have overwhelmed a less technologically sophisticated force. Uzun Hasan escaped but never recovered his offensive capability. The eastern frontier was secured, the Grand Alliance dissolved, and Venice found itself fighting alone. The Crimean Khanate became an Ottoman vassal in 1475, extending Mehmed's influence around the Black Sea and threatening the trade routes that connected Italy to the east. The noose around Venice tightened with each passing year. By the late 1470s, the Republic was exhausted, its treasury depleted, its population worn down by decades of war. Peace came in 1479, and its terms revealed how completely Mehmed had won. Venice surrendered territories it had held for centuries, agreed to pay tribute, and accepted trading rights that depended entirely on Ottoman goodwill. The Republic that had once dominated Mediterranean commerce now operated at the Sultan's pleasure. The sea that Byzantine emperors had called our sea now belonged to the Ottomans. But Mehmed was already planning something that would terrify Europe more than anything since Constantinople's fall. In 1480, an Ottoman fleet appeared off the coast of southern Italy. The landing at Otranto was intended as the opening move of an invasion, the first step toward Rome itself, toward completing the conquest of the Roman world by taking its original capital. Ottoman forces captured the city, massacred or enslaved its population, and established a beachhead on Italian soil. The Pope considered fleeing. European rulers who had ignored Ottoman expansion for decades suddenly faced the possibility that the Sultan's armies might appear at their own gates. The expedition was smaller than a full invasion would require, more a reconnaissance in force than a conquest, but its symbolic weight was enormous. Mehmed had demonstrated that no shore was safe, that the waters separating Italy from the Ottoman domains were no protection, that he could strike the heart of Christendom whenever he chose. Meanwhile, his court had become one of the most sophisticated in the world. Scholars debated philosophy in the shadow of his throne. Artists created works that blended Islamic and European traditions. The Venetian painter Gentile Bellini arrived in 1479 to create the Sultan's portrait, producing the haunting image that still defines how we see Mehmed: intense, controlled, revealing nothing. The conqueror who had waded through blood to take Constantinople could also appreciate beauty, patronize learning, and engage with intellectual traditions that his wars had disrupted. Yet he grew increasingly isolated. The absolute authority he had constructed allowed no intimacy, no equals, no relationships uncomplicated by the gulf between sultan and subject. His grand viziers served at his pleasure and died at his displeasure. His sons were kept at provincial posts, potential rivals to be watched rather than trusted. His harem produced heirs but not companions. The man who ruled millions was profoundly alone, surrounded by servants and supplicants, but intimate with no one. He was 49 years old, and he had achieved more than any sultan before him. Constantinople was his capital. The Byzantine successor states were dust. Venice was humbled. His armies stood on Italian soil. And still, it was not enough. Beyond Italy lay Rome. Beyond the Black Sea lay the Eurasian steppe. Beyond every horizon lay territories that did not yet acknowledge his supremacy. Mehmed began planning new campaigns, always planning, never satisfied, driven by an ambition that conquest could never quite fulfill. In the spring of 1481, Mehmed assembled another army. The target of the campaign remained unclear to most observers. Perhaps Italy, to follow up the Otranto landing. Perhaps Egypt, to challenge the Mamluk Sultanate that controlled the holy cities of Islam. Perhaps eastward again, to settle unfinished business with Persia. Mehmed kept his intentions secret, as he always did, revealing nothing until the moment of action. The army gathered, the logistics were prepared, and the Sultan set out from Istanbul on what would be his final journey. He never reached his destination. On May 3rd, 1481, near the town of Gebze, less than 50 miles from the capital he had conquered and rebuilt, Mehmed died. He was 49 years old. He had ruled for 30 years, conquered an empire, and transformed the world. And he died in his tent, surrounded by attendants, far from the city whose walls he had broken. The circumstances of his death were immediately suspicious. He had been suffering from gout and other ailments for years, but his decline in the final days was sudden, his symptoms consistent with poisoning. His personal physician, a man named Yaqub Pasha, was among those attending him in his final hours. Years later, after Mehmed's son, Bayezid, consolidated power, Yaqub Pasha was executed, a punishment that strongly suggested he had played some role in the Sultan's death, whether on his own initiative or at someone else's direction. The truth will never be known with certainty. Mehmed had made countless enemies over 3 decades of conquest. Nobles whose families he had destroyed, Christians who blamed him for Constantinople's fall, Muslims who resented his religious eclecticism, rivals in his own court who feared his unpredictable wrath. Any of them might have found a way to reach his food or his medicine, or he might simply have died of natural causes, his body finally failing after decades of campaign stress and physical neglect. What is certain is that his death triggered exactly the kind of succession crisis his system was designed to prevent, and in some ways had made inevitable. Mehmed had 2 surviving sons, Bayezid, the elder, governing in Amasya, far to the east, and Cem, the younger, stationed closer to Istanbul in Konya. Ottoman's succession law, if it could be called law, gave the throne to whichever prince could seize it first and eliminate his rivals. Mehmed's own execution of his infant half-brother had established the precedent. There would be one sultan, and all other claimants would die. The Grand Vizier, Karamani Mehmed Pasha, favoured Cem and attempted to conceal the sultan's death long enough for the younger prince to reach the capital. But the Janissaries discovered the deception, rioted in the streets of Istanbul, and killed the Grand Vizier. Word reached both princes simultaneously, and the race for the throne began. Bayezid won. He reached Istanbul first, secured Janissary support through lavish payments, and was proclaimed Sultan while Cem was still gathering forces. The younger brother refused to accept defeat, launching a civil war that lasted years and eventually drove him into exile, first with the Mamluks, then with the Knights of Rhodes, finally as a prisoner of the Pope, a permanent threat that European powers dangled over Bayezid's head for the rest of his reign. Cem died in 1495, probably poisoned, never having set foot in Ottoman territory again. The empire survived the crisis, as it had survived others, but something had changed. Bayezid II was a competent administrator, a patron of learning and a pious Muslim, but he was not his father. He consolidated rather than expanded, preferring diplomacy to war, religious orthodoxy to Mehmed's eclectic curiosity. The relentless forward momentum that had characterized Mehmed's reign slowed to a steadier, more sustainable pace. The Otranto garrison was withdrawn. The invasion of Italy was abandoned. Rome remained unconquered, the final piece of the Roman puzzle that Mehmed had wanted to complete. His successors would expand the empire further. Selim I would conquer Egypt. Suleiman the Magnificent would besiege Vienna. But none of them would match the symbolic weight of what Mehmed had achieved. He had ended an empire that had lasted since Augustus. That accomplishment stood alone. They called him Fatih, the Conqueror, and the name erased everything else he had been. He had been a scholar who read Greek philosophy and debated with learned men. He had been an administrator who created legal systems that governed millions. He had been a patron who built monuments that still define Istanbul's skyline. He had been a man of genuine intellectual curiosity, fluent in 6 languages, interested in art and science and the comparative study of religions. All of that faded into the shadow of one achievement. He took Constantinople. In some ways, the reduction was fair. The conquest of Constantinople was not merely one accomplishment among many. It was the hinge on which everything else turned. Without Constantinople, Mehmed would have been another Ottoman sultan, capable and ambitious, but ultimately limited to Anatolian power politics. With Constantinople, he became something else entirely. The heir to Rome, the ruler of both East and West, the man who ended antiquity and began a new age. The city itself became his monument, more enduring than any tomb or mosque. Istanbul grew after his death into the capital of one of history's greatest empires, its population swelling to over 1 million, its markets drawing traders from 3 continents, its mosques and palaces announcing Ottoman magnificence to every visitor. The walls Mehmed had breached were never rebuilt. They remained as they fell, a permanent reminder of what he had accomplished. The Hagia Sophia he had converted to a mosque still stands, its minarets added by his successors, its Christian mosaics gradually uncovered by modern restorers. The Topkapi Palace he began housed sultans for 400 years, its sprawling complex a physical manifestation of the governmental system he had created. His face looks out from that portrait Bellini painted. Hooded eyes, prominent nose. The expression of a man who calculated everything and revealed nothing. It is the face of someone who understood power in its purest form. Not merely the ability to command obedience, but the ability to reshape reality according to his will. He wanted Constantinople, so he took it. He wanted a new capital, so he built it. He wanted an empire that would endure, so he created systems that survived his death by centuries. The cost was measured in bodies, tens of thousands at Constantinople, tens of thousands more across the Balkans, Anatolia, the Aegean, everywhere his armies marched. He was not uniquely cruel by the standards of his age, but he operated on a scale that made his cruelties uniquely consequential. Cities that had flourished for centuries fell to his armies and never recovered. Populations that had inhabited regions for generations were scattered, enslaved, or exterminated. He built his achievements on a foundation of human suffering that no accounting can fully capture. He would not have understood the objection. Conquerors conquered. Empires rose on the ruins of what they destroyed. The strong took from the weak, and history remembered the strong. This was how the world worked, how it had always worked, how it would always work. Mehmed did what Alexander had done, what Caesar had done, what the prophet's companions had done. He made himself great, and greatness required the destruction of everything that stood in its way. Whether that justification satisfies depends on what one values. Those who admire strength, ambition, and achievement find in Mehmed a figure worthy of the title his people gave him. Those who count costs and remember victims find a man whose accomplishments cannot be separated from the horrors that enabled them. Both perspectives are true. History does not resolve such contradictions. It merely presents them. What remains is Istanbul. The city stands where it has always stood, straddling two continents, guarding the straits that connect two seas. The walls that Theodosius built are ruins now, overgrown and crumbling. Tourists wandering through gaps that Ottoman cannons blasted 5.5 centuries ago. The Hagia Sophia receives visitors of all faiths. No longer a mosque, no longer a church, but a museum of everything it has been. The call to prayer echoes from minarets that Mehmed's successors raised, mingling with the sounds of traffic and commerce, and the endless human activity that fills any great city. Empires rose and fell around those walls. Constantinople endured for 1,000 years, then fell in a single day. The Ottoman Empire that Mehmed built lasted another 4 centuries before it too collapsed, its territories divided among new nations, its sultan exiled, its capital occupied by foreign troops. The Turkish Republic that succeeded it made Istanbul the largest city in Europe once again, its population now approaching 20 million, its reach extending far beyond the walls that once defined it. Through all of these transformations, the city endured. It endured because of its position. No one who controls the straits can be ignored. And because of what it represents, the meeting point of worlds, the place where East and West, Christianity and Islam, Europe and Asia have collided and merged for 2,000 years. Mehmed understood this. He took Constantinople not just because it was wealthy, not just because it was strategically valuable, not just because prophecy promised glory to its conqueror, but because it was the center, the prize that all ambitious men sought, the city whose possession announced supremacy over everything that mattered. He was 21 years old when he took it. He was 49 when he died, still planning conquests, still reaching for horizons he would never reach. In between, he transformed the world, the conqueror, Fatih Sultan Mehmed, the man who took Constantinople and remade it in his image. His city still stands,